Good evening, this is Left, Right and Centre and I'm Nidhi Razdan. It has now been more than 40 days since Russia invaded Ukraine, beginning a long drawn-out war which is now seeing horrific human suffering over the last few days. The images of hundreds of dead bodies lying around in the Ukrainian town of Bucha have stunned and shocked the world. Many of the corpses had their hands tied behind their backs and wounds to the back of their heads. Bucha's mayor says that more than 300 residents in the town had been killed. Satellite images have also shown a 45-foot-long mass grave. Bucha is just outside the capital Kyiv, and the city put up a strong resistance against Russian forces, who then eventually withdrew. Russia has denied it's involved, instead accusing Ukraine of stage managing the dead bodies for the Western media. It claims that this was all done by Kyiv. Western nations led by the United States have called for Russia's actions to be treated as war crimes. As we speak, the United Nations Security Council is meeting, where some of these images have just been shown to Security Council members. It was a stunned room, and President Zelensky addressed them a little while earlier, where he compared Russian forces to terrorists.
This is no different from other terrorists such as Daesh, who occupied some territories. And here it is done by a member of the United Nations Security Council, destroying internal unity, borders, countries, and taking the right of more than a dozen of countries. The civilians were crushed by tanks while sitting in their cars in the middle of the road, just for their pleasure. Women were raped and killed in front of their children. Their tongues were pulled out only because the aggressor did not hear what they wanted to hear from them. Now the world can see that what Russian military did in Bucha while keeping the city under their occupation. But the world has yet to see what they have done in other occupied cities and regions of our country.
Well, absolutely horrific pictures and haunting images that have come out of Bucha in the last few days. And also these images that we're about to show you, for instance, of this Ukrainian mother who's literally preparing for the worst and writing her family's details on her daughter's back, on her child's back, writing the family's details and numbers just in case.
On day 40 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia has retreated from the capital and Ukrainian forces are re-entering previously occupied territory. What they are finding, even a week after Russia's retreat, are corpses of civilians in the streets of Bucha, a town on the outskirts of Kiev.
Це тільки от сьогодні знайшли, а четверту, кажуть, пропав.
At least 300 bodies have been found, many with their hands bound, gunshot wounds to the head or other signs of torture. President Zelensky visited the town and spoke on the atrocities to the United Nations Security Council today. The invasion continues to separate families. Russia has launched an attack on the port town of Odessa, and this family is one of many who've had to part as women and children are evacuated. A heartbreaking photograph of contact details scribbled on a young girl's back has gone viral on social media. Her mother said she is preparing for the worst in case something happens. The US says the extrajudicial killings in Bucha are further evidence that Russia has committed war crimes.
We had already concluded that Russia committed war crimes in Ukraine, and the information from Bucha appears to show further evidence of war crimes. And as the President said, we will work with the world to ensure there is full accountability for these crimes.
After these images came to light, Germany and France said they will expel dozens of Russian diplomats, but Russia says these images are fake.
Но мы все равно сегодня устами нашего постоянного представительства организуем в Нью-Йорке пресс-конференцию, где будут представлены подробнейшие материалы.
Meanwhile, the US says the end of the war is still far, as Russia is revisiting its war aims. Russia is repositioning its troops and planning to surround and overwhelm eastern Ukraine after failing to gain control of key cities. NDTV Bureau Report.
Well, is this going to be a turning point in this war? Joining us on the program today, Oleksandr Merezhko, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament. Also joining us from Moscow today is Fred Weyer, who's a Russian affairs expert and also reports for the Christian Science Monitor. Mr. Raymond Vickery, senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., joining us today. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, who's of course been a veteran diplomat, joining us here in Delhi. And Ksenia Kondrativa is an independent journalist reporting from Russia. She joins us as well. Mr. Merezhko, if I could ask you first, we heard President Zelensky's very passionate speech to the UN Security Council just now. What more does Ukraine expect the world to do at this point? What more do you think the world can do?
Well, first of all, yesterday, me as a member of parliament and a group of Ukrainian members of parliament with our speaker, we came to Bucha. And we saw with our own eyes all the traces of horrible war crimes and acts of genocide committed by Russian troops. I made pictures, I saw mass grave, and it's just terrible. And by the way, our speaker has invited all the speakers in the world, including Speaker of Indian Parliament, to come to Kiev, to visit Bucha, Irpin, and to see for himself what's going on. What we expect that it might become a turning point in this aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine. We need to protect civilians. We need to establish no-fly zone to protect our citizens, innocent civilian citizens, from the atrocities and further acts of genocide against Ukrainians. Because Russians are killing Ukrainians for only one reason, because we are Ukrainians. And they want us to stop being Ukrainians. This is typical genocide, and it can be stopped only by the whole world.
Can I ask you though, and I think President Zelensky hinted at that as well in his speech, is Bucha just the tip of the iceberg? Are you worried that this is something that might be more widespread?
Unfortunately, yes, it's only a tip of the iceberg, because we are revealing each time when Ukrainian troops liberate new town, new village. Some of the villages are completely burned down, destroyed. Several cities like Mariupol has already been destroyed and reduced to the rubble. So, and we're discovering more and more traces and signs of atrocities. We're only beginning to discover the scale of massive systemic war crimes, crimes against humanity, and acts of genocide committed by Russia. We'll have more. So I invite all independent observers from different countries to come and to Kiev, to Ukraine, to go to these towns and villages and to see for themselves what had happened.
Mr. Raymond Vickery, we've heard President Biden also describing these as being akin to war crimes, and there are reports that the US is planning to slap more sanctions against Russia. But is that going to help? Because the sanctions that are already in place don't really seem to have deterred President Putin.
The goal of sanctions is to stop Russian aggression.
Sure. Sorry, that was for Mr. Vickery. I'll come back to you. Sorry, that was for Mr. Raymond Vickery. Yes.
Well, thanks for having me. And indeed, these images coming out of Bucha are extremely distressing and seem to support. They do support what President Biden and Secretary Blinken have been saying in regard to war crimes. I think the question now is, what will the democracies of the world, including India, do in order to try to rein in Russia and wage peace in the world? At this point, India seems only content to stand aside. It is true that immediately sanctions and economic measures do not work instantaneously. But over the longer run, you have to believe and be an optimist that the rule of law can be restored. And I think that these additional measures will be helpful, including exclusion from the SWIFT settlement economically of transactions, I think that India needs to take another look at where its interests lie and support its values, as well as some immediate need for arms or cheap oil.
Let me ask Ambassador Vishnu Prakash about that, because clearly, Ambassador Prakash, until now, India has, as it always does, it looks out for its own. It's looked out for its own interests here, and all countries do that. Certainly, the United States included. But do you think that after these horrors are unfolding in Bucha and possibly elsewhere, that there might be a shift in the Indian position, Ambassador?
Didi, good evening. India has been taking a position which is consistent and independent. Yes, we have been guided by our national interest like any other country has. All that we have done, Nidhi, is not to take the Western dictation on what to say. We also understand the Queen's language. And we have said it very clearly that human rights of Ukrainians should be respected, territorial integrity, sovereignty, etc., etc. So we have left nobody in doubt as to where we stand. All that we have done is, or not done, is to engage in name calling of President Putin, because name calling him a killer, butcher, war criminal is not going to help, nor are sanctions going to help. So what we have to say, we say privately, which is much more effective. But having said that, what we are seeing in Bucha, if true, is horrendous. I would add a word of caution that we have the fog of war. We have a lot of disinformation. I'm not saying this is disinformation, but there should be actually independent investigation as to what has actually happened before taking a decision. But if this has happened, it is heinous, it is heart-rending, and it is absolutely inexcusable.
Would you say, though, as the world's largest democracy, which we apparently pride ourselves on being, that there is a certain moral duty, forget what the other countries are doing, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, that is there a certain moral pressure we have on ourselves now, looking at what is unfolding and saying what you just said, that this is unacceptable, this is horrendous? If not use, if you don't want to attack Putin personally, but at least call them out for this.
No, that goes without saying, because you cannot condone human killing of innocent humans. You cannot condone murder of innocent people. But let us also be very clear that very strong words have been branded about from day one. Genocide is a word that has been used by both sides very liberally. War crimes, etc. There has been a lot of name calling. And it is, again, I would say, that it is very important that in this fog of information warfare, the fact should be established by independent observers, and then necessary steps are taken, because no way, I've said it earlier, I'll say it again, that there's no way you can justify invasion by Russia on Ukraine, whose only fault is that they wanted a life or a future outside the Russian shadow.
Mr. Merezko, would you like to quickly respond to what Ambassador Vishnu Prakash said?
Well, if you have a slightest doubt about the acts of genocide committed by Russians, I invite you personally to come to Kiev. I will take you to Bucha, to Irpin. We'll talk to people. You'll see for yourself what had Russia done to Ukrainians.
Well, thank you. All I'm saying, sir, my heart goes out to the unfortunate victims, and I have said it again, let me say it again. Ukraine's only fault is that it is on a fault zone, geopolitical fault zone. But having said that, I would respectfully submit that the fact should be established by independent observers, because the Russians also have their side of the narrative, which may be correct, which may not be correct. That's all I'm trying to say, nothing more, nothing less.
Let me get Ksenia Kondrativa and Fred Weyer into this. Ksenia Kondrativa, just to get a perspective on how this is playing out in Russia. Firstly, in terms of the sanctions that are already in place, how are they actually hurting or not hurting ordinary Russians at the moment?
The sanctions are definitely hurting Russia's economy, but the people will see it in the longer term. I cannot say that the life has changed dramatically. It has changed for those people who have immediately lost jobs, but it's relatively a small percent of Russians. Going forward, a lot depends on how Russia's financial regulator will play it out. But going forward, we can see big economic shock. So that is one thing. But what is more important is Russia obviously is calling the Bucha incident, Bucha massacre, as a provocation, and it has its own arguments. So as Vishnu Prakash source just said, it's a fog of war, and it's extremely difficult to judge when you are not there. Out of everyone in the panel, only one person has been there yesterday, right, as Sor said, but he has not seen the actual killing. So it's very difficult.
But there are also independent satellite imagery that has corroborated what the Ukrainians are saying in terms of, for example, a 45-foot mass grave, which independent experts have looked at.
Exactly. We don't know who dug the grave. There is no evidence. There are different pieces that have to be pieced together by independent panels. Because the two countries are in the state of war right now. Obviously, each side
a war would imply that it's an equal battle. Is it that?
Excuse me?
Is it an equal battle, a war? Isn't it an invasion? Isn't it aggression by Russia?
So that is very important. Because Russia has initiated, it will always be the aggressor, and it will always be at fault. It will always be, no matter the arguments, any sort of, images work emotionally work against Russia. That's why an investigation on what has happened is very important.
Okay, Fred Weyer, what in terms of how we look at this going forward, nothing seems to be moving Vladimir Putin at the moment. There was some ray of hope last week that a small diplomatic step had been taken, and Russia said it was going to scale back military operations around Kyiv and one other major Ukrainian city. But have the events of the last few days been a massive setback to even those efforts?
I don't think so. It's perfectly clear that Ukraine is winning the information war, like hands down. It is not winning it in Russia, though. There is a counter narrative for everything in Russia, and most of the Russian people, certainly, even in my circle who are educated, professional people, I have a lot of friends who are shocked and horrified by this war, but they've gotten into a support the troops mentality. We're at war. We can't say bad things about our guys. It's not a real enthusiasm for the war, but there is a bunker mentality thing setting in with Russians. And they are kind of accepting their government side of the story. It also needs to be said that there are Russian war correspondents. Unlike Soviet times when they basically made things up in the studio, you have an awful lot of really capable guys, former military guys, embedded with Russian troops, embedded with the Donetsk People's Republic troops in Mariupol, because it is mainly those forces, the Donetsk army that's assaulting Mariupol right now. And they are conveying the images. They are conveying a state of affairs on the ground. So the idea that Russians are not seeing this or not being told isn't quite right. They are seeing it. They're being given a different narrative by those embedded correspondents and by their own leaders, but they are actually seeing the devastation and like Mariupol.
In terms of the options, though, that the West has, further sanctions, etc., are those options limited according to you now? Is there a limit to what the West can do?
I think so. If you're asking me, yeah.
Yes.
I go to my local grocery store, and what do I see? A lot of Western products are disappearing. Big names, there's a certain kind of Kellogg's muesli that I just cannot get. Can't get a Big Mac to save my life. But the things that Russians look for, is there salt? Is there sugar? Is there buckwheat? Is there flour? Those things, the staples, potatoes, cabbage, they're in great quantity, and I think they always will be, because Russia has become self-sufficient in agriculture in the last decade or so. And those are the things that really would move a Russian population. Whether they can get a certain brand of muesli or cheese is not going to move their hearts.
Okay, Mr. Raymond Vickery, your assessment of just what the West can do beyond this, I mean, would you agree that there is really not much more?
No, I think there's a lot more that can be done. There are questions of air defense systems that can be put to Ukraine. There is a question of whether or not additional aircraft can come over and be given to Ukrainians to help themselves. And there's a whole wide range of economic matters that can be done. What U.S. and India need to do as the world's two largest democracies, and they are going to meet in the 2+2 next week, is to figure out how we can wage peace together in this world. The fact is that we're very near to global war with this kind of war crime. And the war crime is not just the slaughter of civilians, and it's ridiculous for Russia to say, well, somehow the Ukrainians tied the hands behind the back of these people and shot their own people in the head in order to present some sort of fake news. That just doesn't fly. There are too many independent journalists who are there who are seeing that. But what the U.S. and India can do, particularly next week in Washington, is figure out how they can wage, how we can wage peace together. And it's not just a question of what India says. What is India going to do? India is a great power. It has a long history of fighting imperialism. And it's not enough just to say, hey, we don't want to do anything that anybody else suggests to us because they're suggesting it. It is a question of what India wants to do in its own interest. And at this point, just standing aside as it has in the United Nations Security Council and elsewhere is not enough. And it does not fit with the values which I have come to know and love over the last 58 years of going to India to see this kind of standing aside. Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, you had a point.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out very respectfully, India is a big power, the US is a greater power. US is against terrorism. When it comes to Afghanistan and waging war on terror, what happened to the Pakistan-based terror groups? They were off limits. The US wanted Indian boots on the ground, but against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, not Pakistan-based terror groups. There is a $10 million award on Hafiz Saeed's head. What has happened? Hafiz Saeed goes around freely, whereas anybody from Daesh or Al-Qaeda is picked up from the air. So let us also understand that, you know, there is the other side of the narrative. It is very easy to advise India, but I think it takes two to tango.
All right, yes.
May I respond to that?
Yes. Yes.
You know, it's not a question of two wrongs making a right. You can criticize the United States all you want, and we have made a lot of mistakes. The question is, what is going to happen now going forward, and what happens in regard to Ukraine? It is absolutely plain that the invasion took place in violation of international law in order to serve imperial interests of Russia. The USSR was nothing but the taking over of the old Russian Empire, and Putin is sworn to try to put it all back together. So the question is not the mistake that we made or what we shouldn't have done. The question is now what the U.S. and India are going to do together in order to be able to further our common values.
All right, I have to leave it at that, but it's really awful to see the kind of, again, the stories, the horror stories coming out of Ukraine. If there is an independent investigation into what's going on in the ground, the question is, who would conduct that investigation? I think, all sides or either side would have a problem with that as well. It's, as Ambassador Vishnu Prakash said, in the fog of war, but there are certain facts that have come to light that have been independently verified, and perhaps it's fine to call a spade a spade. We're also getting a lot of reactions from viewers on coup on this story. Richa, for example, saying it's a gruesome sight to see dead bodies being dumped on each other at Bucha. Russia says it's staged. The Ukraine says it's an incident like the Holocaust. I hope that the truth comes out. Whereas Bindya Naidu has said that why are some countries still supporting Russia? Does the world need to boycott Russia? That's it on Left, Right and Center. See you tomorrow.
Кормят, ну нечем кормить, пожалуйста, помогите нам.